Good morning, everyone. So welcome to chapter 4, completing the accounting cycle. So particularly what we want to figure out today is how do we master closing the books. But before anything else, let's just go through some quick admin matters. So again, reminding everyone that our midterms, so actually ito yung mga make or break natin. We've been preparing for this for quite a while now, but kindly take note that there's only 4 weeks left. So and literally like just 5 sessions. So again, like what I mentioned, if I had to pick ano yung mga pamatay, it would really be accrual accounting. So this is gonna be your quiz next Monday. And then the inventories part. So maraming nalilito sa inventories given na hindi na to tackled in I think high school classes. So let's make sure to really prepare for those two. Some note for our quiz on Monday, we've decided to lump together chapters 3 and chapters 4 into a combined quiz. So expect na more items, around 30 points. But don't worry, madali si completing the accounting cycle, si accrual accounting yung bandayan natin for Monday, right? So with that said, let's go back to our lecture overview for chapter 4. So actually, it's very straightforward. We're already done talking about the accounting cycle, the closing the books, and also understanding the classified financial position. So now we're just gonna make sure now we do a lot of exercises in order to master number one, closing the entries, the different kinds of journal entries, and also working ourselves with the worksheet. So in quiz 2, actually, very proud pero also medyo nahihinayang ako for the class. Very proud in the sense that I feel like around 92% of the class has conceptually mastered chapter 2. So that's a good sign. Pero sayang because not a lot got perfect kasi marami nagkamali in the trial balance, either wrong format, tapos or parang yung pinanghinayangan ko yung tama yung solution pero dun sa final answer, iba yung mga accounts na lumabas. So definitely, I want to emphasize na the most important thing in accounting is procedures. So meaning dapat kailangan i-master natin yung procedures, paulit-ulit natin until we really master it. So with that said, let's jump straight into our exercises for today for completing the accounting cycle. So we have 5 really very quick, very straightforward exercises. But before anything else, let's just quickly run through what we're gonna be discussing, right? So chapter 4 is when we really parang bring together all the weeks of hard work that we've put into completing what we call the accounting cycle, right? And like what we've mentioned, in the full accounting cycle, there are 9 required steps every period. So starting with your analyzing the business transaction, journalizing the transaction, ipopost natin sa T-accounts, and then finally, we come across our very first unadjusted trial balance. And then from there, at the end of the period, we're gonna be journalizing and posting our adjusting entries. And then from there, we're gonna be preparing our second version of the trial balance, so adjusted trial balance. And then finally, financial statements. And then last week, we also mastered na the journalizing and posting the closing entries. And then finally, the last step would be our post-closing trial balance, right? And then, in order to master this, we first took a look at steps 4 to 7, and then we introduced the worksheet. So again, just a reminder, conceptually, for worksheet, it helps provide financial information at an earlier date. So this also serves as our basis for our financial statements. But kindly take note na again, it's just optional and merely a tool to organize the data, right? And then from after we mastered the worksheet, we went to closing entries. And again, just a refresher, closing the books has to have, it relates into 2 versions of the accounts, right? So the 2 types of accounts during closing would be what? Number 1 are temporary or nominal accounts. And these accounts only affect one given accounting period. And therefore, since it's temporary, what we have to do would be to close these accounts. So we have to zero them out in the form of revenues, expenses, and owner's drawings at the end of the period should be at zero balance. We have to close it out. On the other hand, we have permanent accounts or our real accounts, wherein it relates to 2 or more future accounting periods, and we don't close these accounts. So we just update them. So anything that has to do with your assets, your liabilities, your owner's capital, we don't zero them out. We update them from period to period in our balance sheet, right? So with that said, again, like what I've mentioned, closing entries, actually, you can easily memorize them into 4. First, close your revenue into your income summary. Second, close your expenses, all of your expenses into your income summary. And then you find the current balance of the income summary. So for this particular example, since it's a net income, we have an outstanding credit of income summary of 2,906. And therefore, in order to close this debit account, we have a current credit income summary of 2,906, right? Kasi mas mataas si 12,800 kaysa kay 9,894. And therefore, since may credit balance siya, in order to zero it out, we recognize a debit of income summary and then we close it to our capital. Same with our drawings. The drawings has a normal debit account. And therefore, in order to close it, we credit the drawings to the capital. So debit capital, credit drawings, right? And then finally, after we did our closing entries, we basically create our post-closing trial balance wherein you can see that before, si revenues nandyan pa, si drawings nandyan pa before, right? And the expenses. But now all of them are zeroed out because they're temporary accounts and only the permanent accounts remain with Escuno Capital. So 2 things to note. So I don't think we'll have time to discuss the quiz, but I promise to send out the results via email today. But then I think the common mistakes would be number 1, I'm not sure kung nagkulang tayo sa emphasis. But then again, trial balances are organized by their appearance in the chart of accounts. And by standard, your chart of accounts will always start with your assets, your liabilities, and then your equity accounts, your owner's capital, your owner's drawings, your revenues, and your expenses. In the quiz, I heard that I saw a lot, around siguro 20% of the class, they created their trial balance alphabetically. So I understand the confusion na parang since walang chart of accounts, we'll do it alphabetically. But given our previous exercises in the worksheets, it would be hard to have a trial balance if it's organized alphabetically. Instead, they're always grouped by their accounting component. So again, it's grouped always as assets first, liabilities, then equity, then revenue, and then expenses. So don't worry, for those that conceptually tama yung trial balances nila pero mali yung format. We just deducted 1 point para lang everyone remembers na similar with financial statements, format is everything in terms of post-closing trial balances and other kinds of trial balances, right? So actually that ends our quick recap. So now let's test our mastery. So let's first go to 4.2. Is there anyone who wants to walk me through the worksheet for this portion? Are there any volunteers? Sige. I think Ross yung nauna. Yeah. So I think I saw Ross, Anna, and Isabel. So gawin na lang natin. Ross, can you help us walk us through sa income statement? Anna sa equity, and then Isabel for balance sheet, right? So hi Ross, good morning. So right now I just copied what was given, which is the adjusted trial balance, right? And our first step is we have to create our income statement. So can you help us walk through paano natin kukunin yung income statement using our worksheet?
We just transfer po yung mula drawings. Mula service revenue hanggang interest expense sa income statement na
Correct. Yeah, so we transfer it to the income statement. And then we total them, right? Ano yung totals nila, Ross?
For the debit, 12,307, and for the credit, 15,590.
Okay. So hindi siya nag-balance. So what's missing here, Ross?
A debit of 3,290. 283. para
Yep.
magbayad.
Of 15,590. Correct. So now we have all of the information that we need, right? So now we can plot it out into our formal statement. So again, so what would be our headers for this, Russ?
Tie interior, then income statement, then for the month ended April 30, 2020.
Yep. And then our main components under income statement would be,
Income and expenses.
and then your
Or
and then it will help you arrive at your net income. So let's go first with income. What would be things under income?
the service revenue lang po.
Okay, correct. And then under expenses, they would be what?
The salaries and wages expense, rent expense, depreciation expense, and interest expense.
Okay, perfect. And then we total them and it will total to 12,307, right? Kasi
Yes,
yeah. So ultimately our net income would be
3,280.
yeah. So actually no need to compute because everything is already in the worksheet. Okay, perfect. Actually a really good walkthrough. Thank you so much, Russ. So now let's move on to the next. Anna, sorry. Can you help us with changes in owner's equity? But in order to do so, i-complete muna natin si statement of financial possession.
Ako din po ba, sir? I thought si Isabel.
Yeah, I mean, sorry. In order to arrive with changes in owner's equity, let's transfer, i-complete muna natin yung worksheet. Yeah.
So, cash, 10,000. Ay, copy over.
Copy over, yeah. So from
10,000.
cash to drawings.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Anna. And then, what's next?
And then we subtotal debit and credit.
Okay. And then parang may kulang. So what do we, ano yung kulang natin sa statement of financial possession? Ano kaya?
Add the net income sa credit side.
Okay. Yeah. Correct. And then finally, our last step to fill out the chart would be
Total everything. So, 46,820.
perfect. So again, kindly take note, everyone in class, na pag debit to, credit siya sa financial possession. Secondly, if it's a credit, you can expect na debit siya sa statement of financial possession. But if this is parang something na parang you don't want to memorize, just make sure to subtotal and kung ano yung butas, that would usually be your net income. Okay, perfect. So thank you so much, Anna. So with this, what are the things that we need to look at in order to create our changes in owner's equity?
The capital, net income, and drawings.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. So now, let's do with the format, Anna. What would be our headers?
Tie interior, owner's equity statement for the month ended April 30, 2020.
Okay. And then what would be our main components for this financial statement?
So, C tie capital April 1, and then add, and then less, and then C tie capital
Okay.
April 30.
Perfect. Okay, so let's fill them out. So what would be your beginning capital, Anna?
27,960.
Okay, got it. Yeah. And then, what are our funds?
Investments 0 since they didn't invest, and then
yeah.
net income 3,000.
Yep. So we just get the subtotal of 31,240. And then what would we subtract from this?
Less drawings 3,650.
Yep. So what would be your ending capital, kaya Anna?
27,593.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. So very straightforward. So actually now, if you notice, mas mabilis na tayo gawa ng financial statements. Yeah. Thank you so much, Anna. Okay, so let's end this with Isabel. Tama ba? Yeah. So yeah. So let's create our classified balance sheet, right? So medyo mahaba siya. So let's first look at the format, Isabel. So what would be our headers?
Tie interior statement of financial position as of April 30, 2020. And
Okay.
then
What would be our yeah. Sorry. And then what would be our components kung classified siya, Isabel?
So for the assets, we have current assets, non-current assets, and then the total of that.
Okay.
And then for the liabilities and owner's equity, current liabilities, non-current liabilities, and owner's equity.
Yep. And then we'll total, right? So what would be our current assets, Isabel?
Cash, a debit balance of 10,000, and then accounts receivables, 7,840, prepaid rent. The total would be 20,120. Total, yeah. And
Correct.
then equipment, 23,050. Less accumulated depreciation for equipment, 4,900. And the total would be 18,150.
Yep.
So the total assets is 38,270.
Okay, perfect. And then we proceed to our liabilities. So we expect na this portion would total 38,270, right? So what would be our current liabilities, Isabel?
Accounts payable, 4,920. Interest payable, 57. That would be 4,977.
Correct.
And then for the non-current, notes payable, 5,700. Yeah, so the total liabilities would be 10,677.
Yep, correct. And then the owner's equity would be?
27,593.
Yeah, so hindi siya lumabas sa worksheet. I mean, it's not intuitive, right? Pero kukunin natin siya from our changes in owner's equity. So in total, we get 38,207. So thank you so much, Isabel. So for me, for a classified balance sheet, memorization, familiarization lang to, right? You know na prepaid rent, usually it lasts within a year or the operating cycle. So they'll always be current assets. Pero pag nag-extend ng 1 year si prepaid rent, a portion of it would be current, another portion of it would be non-current, right? Notes payable, generally, they're long-term. They're more than 1 year. Pero if there's a portion that's due within 1 year, that portion would be current and then the other portion would be non-current. So again, familiarize yourselves lang with the accounts, right? So with that said, bilis, right? So we're able to complete all of our 3 financial statements. So now, I think the next step would be to close these accounts. Yes, Anna, or is there a question? Yeah.
Sir, instead of non-current assets, can the header be property, plant, and equipment?
Okay. So good question, Anna. So under non-current assets, right? We have major classifications. So under non-current assets, so medyo advanced accounting na to. Pero under non-current, your usual non-current would be intangible assets. So intangible assets, marami ang components. Patent, copyright, goodwill. So technically, parang patents dito and then, intangible assets is mataas and then meron pa siyang subcategorizations, right? So similarly, property, plant, and equipment would have buildings, land, equipment under them, right? But all of them, property, plant, equipments, intangible assets, are still under the major heading non-current assets, right? So meaning that we still have to put current assets, non-current assets, and then you can even categorize them na intangible assets una, so we put patent, etc., and then property, plant, expense. Pero again, hopefully, ay under siya ng non-current asset. Yeah. But thank you so much for that question, Anna. I hope that was clear. Kindly give me a thumbs up na lang, Anna, if I was able to answer your question. Yeah. Okay. Perfect. So now, is there anyone who wants to help us close? So we're in step 8 of the 9-step procedure. How can we close these accounts? So what are the 4 closing entries that we need for this one? If there are no volunteers, okay. Kaylin. Hi, Kaylin. Good morning.
Hi, good morning.
Yeah. So let's first close our revenue accounts. What would be our first closing entry, Kaylin?
Debit service revenue, credit income summary, 15,000.
Yep. So we just get it from our income statement, right? And then we close our expense account. So what would be our journal entry for this?
Debit income summary, credit salaries and wages expense, rent expense, depreciation expense, and interest expense.
Yep, correct. So we have na nagtotal siya ng 12,307, which is equivalent to our total of our expenses. So with that said, currently, Kaylin, what would be the balance of our income summary right now?
Yung net income po, which is 3,283.
Yeah, perfect. Correct. So 3,283. And since it's a net income, we have a current credit income summary, right? So we want to zero that out. So let's close the income summary. So what would be our third journal entry for this?
Debit income summary, credit owner's capital, 3,283.
Yep, correct. And then finally, si owner's drawings na lang, which is we can find here, which would be, what would be our ultimate journal entry?
CTI capital, debit, credit, CTI drawings,
Yep, of 3,000.
650.
Yep, correct. Yun. So actually yun lang. So thank you so much, Kilin. So again, closing entries, for me, they're one of the easiest just because you just memorize it, right? So definitely, kapag nag-net loss si company, you can expect na these journal entries would change, right? Particularly, si journal entry number 3, right? If net loss, your income summary, instead of a debit, it would probably be a credit to your tie capital, which is consistent, right? Net losses decrease your capital. So similarly, drawings decrease your capital. And therefore, debit tie capital, credit, net loss, credit, drawings, right? So kindly make sure, so it's good that you memorize the 4, but then be flexible. Kapag net income, ito yung expectation ko. Kapag net loss, ito yung expectation natin. Right? So kindly take note. I'll leave it up to you to look for examples na net loss, pero make sure na you know how to close even if net loss. Huwag kakabahan. Right? So now, click quickly, visual representation lang, right? On what we did. Basically, in closing, our number 1 parang North Star would be owner's capital. Si expenses, si revenues, will be close to income summary, whereas the income summary and the owner's drawings will ultimately be close to owner's capital, which would be a permanent account, right? So quickly going through lang. So step 1, we had closing the revenues. So right now, may debit balance si revenues. And therefore, what we want to do is to credit balance si revenue. So we wanted to post a debit and then correspondingly a credit to your income summary. So ang mangyayari would be mazi-zero out si revenues, pero magkakaroon na tayo ng credit na 15,509. Kaya debit service revenue, credit income summary, right? Then we move on to the second journal entry. We want to close out our expenses. Currently, all of them are in debit, and therefore we want to recognize credits in order to close them out and make this 0. And then therefore, we also want to recognize debits naman on the income summary. So therefore, it's debit 12,307 income summary, and then credit 12,307 in expenses. But then again, broken down into your different categorizations. So now, the next step for income summary, wag malilito, would be, ano ba yung balance ni income summary? If it's a net income, it will have a balance of 3,283. Therefore, in order to close this out, we want to recognize a debit 3,283 para i-zero out si income summary. But since debit income summary, credit CTI capital, right? 3,283. These are just current balances of your other owner's capital, right? Then finally, si drawings na lang, which is we close them out by debit si owner's drawings, so we recognize a credit, and therefore we just recognize a debit in owner's capital. With our fourth closing journal entry, debit CTI capital, credit CTI drawings, right? So there, everything is close to our North Star, which would be our owner's capital. So basically, if we create our post-closing trial balance, it's very procedural, right? Ang naiba lang, so copy everything from the worksheet, ang naiba lang si CTI capital, right? Na 27,593. So all of our temporary accounts are closed out to 0, and all our permanent accounts are updated. So real accounts are updated, nominal accounts are closed out. So 27,593, this is basically from our owner's capital T account, right? So we're done with 4.2, right? So if there are any questions, kindly type it in the chat or raise your hand. So if none, let's go to the 4 different journal entries, right? So we have 4 from adjusting entries to correcting entries. And let's focus first on reversing entries. We say na reversing entries are optional. These are for people na gusto nila padaliin yung pag-record nila ng future entries in the period. So they only affect one type of account. And those would be our adjusting entries, specifically accrual entries only. So we don't reverse deferrals, okay? And then when do we record our reversing entries? If the adjusting entries are at the last day of the period, the reversing entries are at the first day of the accounting period. And therefore, what are our accrual entries? These are our accrued revenue adjusting entries, asset, debit, credit revenue. Literally, i-reverse nyo lang. Debit revenue, credit asset. For our accrued expenses, it's debit expense, credit liability. So our reversing entry would be, i-reverse nyo lang. Debit liability, credit expense for accrued expenses. And then throwback to our example sa Kuno Consulting. So pare-pareho lang si normal entry, si adjusting entry, si closing entry. Nagkaiba lang sila sa June 1 and June 2 entries. On the left side, we opt na, okay, optional si reversing entry. Ayoko, tinatamad ako mag-reversing entry. Pero, ang payoff nun is, technically, mas mahirap siya because you have to make a compound journal entry. So again, around 5% or around 8% of the class, sa theory, they got a mistake in the compound journal entry. Your compound journal entry affects 3 accounts, meaning it's not just one debit or one credit, it's at least parang isa debit or isang credit, may more than one, right? So in this case, you have 2 debits, your expense and your payable, and then 1 credit in your cash, right? So on the right side, since hindi tayo tinamad, we created reversing entries, right? And therefore, madali na lang si normal entry. So now, let's prove na it's optional. So is there anyone in class who wants to do 4.19? Yeah. If none, okay. Okay, Kiara. Okay. So thank you so much, Kiara. So siguro we can do until letter E. And then let's just see if anyone else volunteers for the second for F to G, right? So hi Kiara, good morning. So first thing, what would be our closing entries for our temporary accounts?
So we have 3 po. The first one would be to close the service revenue. So it
Yeah.
would be debit the service revenue of 92.5 and credit it to income summary 92.5.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And then the next one, to close expense, income summary will be debited 7.7 and then credit interest expense 7.7.
Correct.
And then last, close the income summary. So debit income summary 84,800 and then credit it to owner's capital 84,800.
Yeah. So actually, perfect explanation, Kiara. So basically, we just found out na may credit balance and that's why debit siya sa income summary, right? So before I turn you over to the next letter B, some people prefer na there's an alternative method. So this is actually pwede sa class, but then I'd prefer na we use the 4 entries. So some people, no more income or summary, they just do straight to capital, meaning hindi na to income summary, shihata capital na. And then debit, shihata capital. And ultimately, it will give you the same results, right? So thank you so much, Kiara. You perfectly explained the primary method. Pero for the alternative method, straight na siya to capital, right? And pero don't worry, if you prefer the alternative method, ultimately, pareho lang yung ginagawa natin. Na at the end of the day, we're crediting Shihata Capital for 84,800. Yeah. So thank you so much, Kiara. Let's go to B. But before anything else, I wanted to quickly ask you, what were the adjusting entries made for B before we talk about reversing entries?
Okay po. For the first one, for the revenue, it was accounts receivable debit 5,000 and then credit service revenue 5,000.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. And then the second adjusting journal entry would be,
For the expense, interest expense debit 2,200 and then credit interest payable 2,200.
okay. So my next question is, we know these are adjusting entries. But are these both accruals, Kiara?
Yes po.
Yeah. So if they are, then we expect na meron silang reversing entries, right? So now that we know the context, let's go na to the real question. So what would be the reversing entries for this, right?
For the first one, debit service revenue 5,000 and then credit accounts receivable 5,000.
Yep. So correct. So debit service revenue, credit accounts receivable. And then for the second one,
For the second one, debit interest payable 2,200 and credit interest expense 2,200.
yep, correct. So 2,200. So madali lang si reversing entries, right? So now let's go to post the entries here. So actually this is very procedural. So I'll just walk us through this Kiara, so ako na lang. So basically, we just look at our four accounts: receivable, service revenue, interest payable, and insurance expense. And then we just plug it in, right? So debit, service revenue, credit interest expense, debit service revenue again, credit accounts receivable, debit interest payable, credit interest expense, right? And then we total everything, and then we get their end. So one thing na I want to highlight is the service revenue and the insurance expense. Kasi ito yung technically, upon closing, they should have been zeroed out, right? But now they have this weird entry na si service revenue has a debit of 5,000 and si insurance expense has a credit of 2,200, right? So the reason why it's weird is because we created reversing entries. So now let's take a look at the effect, right? So Kiara, for D, what would be the entries na we do for the next period to record the collection and the payment? Yeah.
For the first one, it would be to debit cash 5,000 and then credit service revenue 5,000.
Yep, correct. And then our second would be?
The second one, debit interest expense 3,000 and credit cash 3,000.
Yep, correct. So therefore, if we had to plot it out, so again, remember, instead of zeroed out, si service revenue has a debit, right? So I'll walk us through again here, Kiara. So basically, what we did lang was credit service revenue and then debit the 3,000. And then because of this, na zero out si service revenue. Meaning tama naman, there is no revenue that we should record for this particular account. Because those revenues were in the previous period. Pero yung 3,000, may balance tayo na debit. So that's the correct normal balance of an insurance. Meaning 800 of the 3,000 is an interest expense for this period. And then the 2,200 was an interest expense of the previous period. So at the end of the day, our current balance for service revenue is at 0, which is correct. And then 800 debit, which is insurance expense of 800, right? So now, so thank you so much, Kiara. Very clear and very concise. So now let's pretend na no reversing, right? So kindly let me know if there's any questions. Pero pag no reversing, basically mas madali yung buhay natin in the first part. We just plot out our closing entries, right? And as expected, since closing entries siya, both service revenue and insurance expense are zeroed out, right? Wala silang balance as it should be, right? But then, mahihirapan tayo sa pag-record ng entries in the next period. Mahihirapan, quote-unquote, meaning you'd expect like a compound journal entry, right? So we have cash of 5,000, accounts receivable of 5,000, straightforward pa rin. Pero now, mas mahirap si 2.1, which is interest expense 800, interest payable of 2,200 because yung interest expense was closed out to your interest payable. And then your credit would be cash 3,000. So now, if we plot it out, si 800 lang yung magkakaroon ng effect for service revenue and insurance expense. That ultimately will give you the same balances as your, kung nag-reverse ka man or hindi, pareho yung balances ng revenue mo and insurance expense. So you only have a debit of 800 to signify the 800 of your insurance expense. So if we compare, if with reversing, mas madali si journal entry number 2. Without reversing, medyo mas compound journal entry si journal number entry 2, right? So, in a sense, to summarize, when we reverse our revenue and expense accounts, magkakaroon sila ng contra-normal balances. Si service revenue has a weird debit of 5,000. Si insurance expense has a weird credit of 2,200. Pero as a trade-off, madali yung journal entries natin. And then at the end of the day, when we plot it out, magkakaroon ka ng zeroed out service revenue and then an 800 debit of your insurance expense. So to prove that they're optional, let's look at the without reversing method on the right? So at the start, zeroed out siya kasi walang reversing entries that messed up our T accounts. So 0 service revenue, 0 insurance expense. The trade-off of not using reversing entries is you have a compound journal entry for your accrued expenses, right? And therefore, ipa-plot out lang natin si 800. Pero at the end of the day, service revenue 0, insurance expense 800, service revenue 0, insurance expense 800. So regardless kung nag-reverse ka man or hindi, it's still the same outcome, right? So again, the key takeaway here, even in theory, reversing entries are optional, right? So now let's go to the last one, correcting entries. And we said na correcting entries, if reversing entries are optional, correcting entries are avoidable, right? So let's create correcting entries when an error is discovered. So now, I said, chapter 4 is easy. Ang mahirap lang sa chapter 4 would be correcting entries. Now, in the quiz, unfortunately, a lot of people got super high, pero there were like a percentage of the class around siguro 5%, 8% that did pretty, so medyo nag-fail sila because of correcting entries. Basically, dun sa trial balance, they were having a hard time parang correcting the entries and then dire-diretso na yun. So, since hindi nila na-correct, mali yung mga balances sa trial balance, ultimately, hindi nag-balance yung trial balance. And therefore, correcting entries would be your mahirap portion of chapter 4 because there are no entries you can memorize. We have to analyze, right? So, take note na it affects a combination of accounts depending on the error, right? So, these are avoidable, but then if they have accountants that make mistakes, like pari ako minsan, nagkakaroon ako ng mistakes sa mga slides, let's make sure to correct the entries, right? So, let's do 4.6. Is there anyone who wants to answer 4.6 in the class? If none, okay, there. Sige. Clarence, yeah. Thank you, Anna. So let's go with Clarence. Quickly lang, Clarence, let's use this format. So I said, wala kang memorization sa correcting entries. But what you can control is your steps on how to get your correcting entry. So again, step 1, analyze what the entry was made, what is. Step 2, determine the correct entry, what should be. And then analyze the understatements and the overstatements. And then step 4, create your correcting entry. So let's follow this format, Clarence. Step 1 for number 1, what is the entry made?
So the entry that was made is a debit of 950 in cash and a credit in accounts receivable of 950 as well.
Correct. But then ano ba dapat yung what should be the correct entry dapat, Karen?
Okay. So dapat yung cash is debit at 590 and accounts receivable is credit at 590.
Correct. So nagkamali lang siya sa paglagay ay yung parang nagkapalit yung numbers, right? So, what would be the understatements and the overstatements here, Clarence?
So here, sir, the accounts receivable is understated and the cash is overstated. Wait. Baliktad, wait.
Ay, de, pero okay lang. So, overstated sila pareho. Kasi right now, it's 950, pero 590. So, actually, itong step 3, honestly, parang it takes me a while rin. But importantly, paano kaya natin siya i-correct? Yeah, yun. What would be the correcting entry natin, Clarence, for this?
Ayun, so yung correcting entry was a debit in accounts receivable $360 and then a credit in cash of $360.
Yep. So in essence, parang pinababa natin siya. So again, for the people na parang want to simplify this solution, actually arte ko lang yung analyze the understatements. Pero usually kasi ito yung pumapatay sa akin during our midterms. So make sure lang na you're familiar lang rin with this. But in essence, you can just do steps 1, 2, and 4, right? So thank you so much, Clarence. Let's move on to set number 2. What was the entry made na mali?
Okay, so the entry that was made was a debit in miscellaneous expense of $75 and then a credit of $75 in cash.
Yep. And then what should have been the correct entry?
So what should have been is a debit in advertising expense of $75 and then a credit in cash of $75.
Correct. So in terms of analyzing, I'll just give it na lang. And therefore, our correcting entry should be what kaya, Clarence?
So the correcting entry should be a debit of $75 in advertising expense and then a credit in $75 in miscellaneous expense.
Yep, so correct. So basically, we have advertising expense and miscellaneous expense, right? And then number 3. So what would be the what is the incorrect entry made?
Okay, so the incorrect entry was a debit of $1,900 in salaries and wages expense and a
Yep.
credit of $1,900 in cash.
Yeah. So kasi sabi nila ni-record raw na ganun. Pero what should be the correct entry for the first salary payment for this month?
Okay, so the correct entry should be a compound entry. So a debit of $1,900 in salaries and wages expense, then a credit in salaries and wages payable of $700, and then a credit of $1,200 in cash.
Correct. So my question, Clarence, do you think nag-reversing entries this particular account or not?
Hindi siya nag-reversing entry.
Correct. Kasi nag-compound journal entry siya here, right? So
Yes,
mas
sir.
complicated. Yeah, correct. Good catch, Clarence. So basically, ang nangyari is overstated si salaries and then overstated rin si wages payable, right? So meaning, what would be your correcting entry for this, Clarence?
So we have to wait lang.
Go lang.
We have to debit salaries and wages payable with 700. Ay, debit ba?
Yeah.
O, tama,
Yeah,
debit.
correct.
And then we credit salaries and wages expense
Yep.
with 700.
700. Yeah. So basically, salaries, wages payable, may 700 siyang difference, right? And therefore, debit, payable, credit, expense, right? So last 2, purchase on account, costing 310. What was the error made?
Okay, so what was input was supplies debit $310 and accounts payable credit $310.
Yeah, correct. Yeah. And then, what should be the correcting entry? Correct entry, sorry. What should have
So-
been the correct entry? Yeah.
Dapat ano siya, debit of $310 in equipment tapos credit of $310 in accounts payable.
Yep, correct. And then finally, so basically parang nangyari was overstated sa supplies, understated sa equipment. And therefore, our correcting entry would be?
So it would be a debit of $310 in equipment and a credit of $310 in supplies.
Yep, correct. So in essence, that debit equipment, credit supplies of 310. And then finally, number 5, what would be our last incorrect entry? Sorry.
Ayun, so
Sorry.
so there was a debit in $69 for equipment and then a credit of $69 in cash.
When in fact, it should have been?
It should have been a debit of $96 in miscellaneous expense and a credit of $96 in cash.
Yeah, correct. And then finally, that would mean that you have overstated equipment, overstated cash, and understated miscellaneous expense. So ultimately, what would be our correcting entry? for this, Clark?
Okay. So the correcting entry would be a debit of $96 in miscellaneous expense, a credit of $69 in equipment, and a credit of $27 in cash.
Yep. So compound siya, wherein you have debit miscellaneous expense of 96, and then you lower equipment by 69 and lower cash by 27, right? So
Yes, sir.
yeah. So thank you so much, Clarence. Actually, very straightforward. Again, tip ko sa iba, kung nahirapan kayo sa compound journal entry, there's an alternative method na just reverse the incorrect and then just make the correct. So if the alternative method here is debit cash of 69, credit equipment of 69, and then make your correct entry, which is debit miscellaneous expense 96, credit cash 96. It's the same, but you can also use compound journal entry, right? And then the rest are very procedural, right? So basically, we just have a 3-column. So the people that had the neatest solutions, basically ganito yung ginawa nila. They had a debit column and a credit column, and then they just reflected the journal entries, the 5 journal correcting entries, right? And then in essence, basically, you can then plot it out to your trial balance, right? So you start with accounts receivable. So so cash 3,740, so accounts receivable 3,560, advertising expense so 675, miscellaneous expense 215, right? And then salaries, wages payable 700. So naging 0 because credit siya, debit to, so 0, right? Salaries, wages, expense. So again, from 3,3 naging 2,6. Then you have your equipment na plus 310, your supplies na minus 310, naging 490. Your miscellaneous expense na plus 96. So 215 plus 96 is 311. Equipment, so babawasan ng 69. Right? And then you have your cash of 27 na babawasan rin. So therefore, basically, that's how you adjust your trial balance. Right? So we're done with Pulsar. So the last would be actually theory. So the last reset for today would be, let's classify the financial statements, right? So again, you can group them into current assets if you can expect to realize their value within 1 year of the business operating cycle. So kindly take note na it should be always in the order of liquidity. For non-current assets, it's beyond 1 year of business's operating cycle. So ito rin in the order of liquidity, right? For current liabilities, if it's within the normal operating cycle, if your purpose is for you to trade it, if it should be settled within 12 months after and you have no right to defer settlement, those would be current liabilities. Non-current liabilities are those that are liabilities or obligations after 1 year of an operating cycle. Sa equity, madali lang yung equity natin because 99.1. Pero kindly take note that there are different forms of equity for partnership and corporation. So sa theory, kindly familiarize yourself what are the equity under partnership, what are the equity under corporation, right? And then finally, you have notes, right? So last reset for today, who wants to help us classify the accounts lang? So super quick lang, we have 16 accounts. And let's just classify them. Yeah. So go ahead, Denise. Good morning.
Good morning, sir. So the accounts payable will be under current liabilities. Accounts receivable will be under current assets. Cash under current assets. Owner's capital under owner's equity. Patents will be under intangible assets po. And then salaries and wages payable, current liabilities, inventory, current assets, share investments to be sold in 7 months, current assets, share investments to be sold in 2 years, long-term investments, accumulated depreciation, equipment, PPE, buildings, PPE, land and use, PPE, notes payable, non-current liabilities, supplies, current assets, equipment, PPE, and prepaid expenses under current assets as well po.
Yep. Actually, perfect, Denise. Correct. So basically, things to note. I think everything here is familiar with all of us. except patents. So patents are basically parang an asset na parang if you have a patent, only you can use the certified patent, and therefore that's a benefit to you, right? And that's an intangible asset. You can't touch a patent. It's like a document, and it's your right na not other companies can use your patented assets, right? So it's a non-current asset because it's usually has a long life, so more than 1 year yung patent. Another thing, be careful with bond investments. Since it said investments, it's a long-term investment. It should be a non-current asset. Usually kasi when people see bonds, iniisip nila bonds payable. So if bonds payable to be held for more 2 years, there should be a non-current liability. But since it explicitly stated that it's a bond investment, it should be a non-current asset. Share investments to be sold in 7 months is less than 1 year, and therefore it is a current asset. So actually, very straightforward, right? So now let's make the classified balance sheet for Sai Bowling Alley. So the last receipt for today, who wants to complete the classified balance sheet for this, right? So quickly going through lang the format of a classified balance sheet. Okay, si Sophie. Yeah. Hi, good morning. Okay, so let's start with the headers. Sophie, yeah.
Yes, sir. Sai Bowling Alley, then classified statement of financial position, then December 31, 2020.
Yep.
And then for assets po, under assets, current assets.
Yeah.
Under that po, cash.
Ay, sorry, tama. So, pero what are the formats muna? So, current assets, and then what
Then-
would be the other headers? Yeah.
Long-term assets po.
Yeah. So, non-current. Yep. And then we total the assets. And then on the right side, you have your
Liabilities and plus owner's equity po.
yeah. And then what are the different components under this?
Current liabilities, long-term liabilities, then total po ng liabilities, and
Yeah.
then owner's equity. Then
Yep.
total.
Yep. Okay. So we're done with the format. Thank you so much, Soph. So basically, let's plug in na lang the classifications, right? So current assets muna tayo.
Cash, accounts receivable. Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Sorry. Then prepaid insurance, 4,680.
Yeah.
Then for non-current assets, land, 65,000. Buildings, 86,200.
Yeah.
Then-
Go lang. Correct. So.
Then equipment po, 43,680.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So apologies. So for this, the format that I'd recommend is you both equipments and both buildings, they depreciate, right? So i-partner natin si equipment and their accumulated depreciation to arrive with their book values, right? So building, less ACDEP, and si land, right? So in the quiz, let's just make use of that format. So I think yun yung learning highlight for this particular exercise. But correct yung itemizations natin. So in total, our total non-current assets would be 194,880. So what would be our total assets? So in your exercise?
Total assets po, 232,120.
Yep, correct. And then our liabilities and owner's equity, what would be our current liabs? Yeah.
Accounts payable, 12,300. Notes payable to be paid in 2021, 30,000. Interest payable, 3,800.
Yep. And then what would be our non-current?
Notes payable for 2022 onwards, which is equal to 67,780. Then total liabilities, 113,880.
Yep, correct.
Then under owner's equity po, White Sai Capital, 113,000. Then minus net income, which is
Yeah.
5,240 equals 118,240.
Yep.
Then total liabilities and equity, 232,120.
Yep, perfect. So thank you so much, Soph. So kindly take note lang. So I think correct. So actually for the format, kindly take note lang to always pair your accumulated depreciation with the related asset. So as you can see, ang pinaka-hassle kung ayun na sinusulat is accumulated depreciation building, accumulated depreciation equipment. Pero the reason why they're so specified is so that you can always arrive with their book value, right? So kindly take note lang for non-current assets that it should always be paired. So equipment less ACDEP, building less ACDEP, and then land never depreciates. So if you're looking for investments, land is actually a pretty good investment. So actually, that ends our exercise breakdown for today. So again, thank you so much, class, for understanding. But like what I mentioned, I think naman we were able to go through all the important concepts for closing the books. Yun. So that actually ends chapter 4. So basically that also ends our lecture for today. So next steps natin would be number 1, I will email within the day our results for quiz 2. So like what I've mentioned, I think that around 92% of the class mastered already chapter 2. So that's a good sign, right? And then some medyo sumabit lang tayo sa trial balance. So kindly let me know and let's schedule a consultation if hindi pa rin clear like yung correcting entries, trial balance. Because again, and I'm gonna remind the class, if chapter 2 was around 150% more difficult than chapter 1. Chapter 3 and chapter 4 is even more difficult than chapter 2. So again, for me, accruals, deferrals, yun yung pamatay. Tapos nasamahan pa ng completing the accounting cycle. So our quiz 3 on Monday is actually, so our quiz 3, so quiz 3 will compose of chapter 3 and chapter 4. So yun. And then on Thursday, if may mga questions pa, I'll allot the 11:30 to 12 to talk about how to do the trial balance in quiz 2 para lang clear everyone else. Yun. Pero optional yun. That's after class time. So optional lang for you to attend. But that's not gonna be recorded. So kindly take note na I'll just extend quote unquote for those that want to have like a more formal quiz 2 walkthrough. For the exercises, I will only return muna yung quiz 2. Sorry, I'm still checking exercises 3 and exercise 4. I'm targeting to send them out by before quiz 3 at the very least para lang alam niyo rin yung mistakes. So with that said, thank you so much everyone and have a great day. So I'll end the recording na now. Thank you.